Things keeps on happening around us. When we see things, we see the actions, but every action is triggered by another action we call as factors. In our previous video, we have already learned about factors. If you haven't watched the video, I recommend you watching it first. When the factors are changed, it triggers change in the outcome of the action, and in science, we often call these factors as variables. In today's lesson, we will learn everything you need to know about variables. Let's take a simple example of boiling water. When you boil the water, is it same if you boil water in an open pot and the closed pot? Or is it same if you boil water in the low flame or the high flame? Certainly not, right? So, what differences can you observe there? In open pot, the water will boil slower, while in closed pot it will be faster, right? Similarly, water boils faster in the higher flame than in the lower flame. So, what do we know from here? The time taken by water to boil changes with change of small things like covering the pot or changing the flame. Now, from here, we can say variables can change the result of any scientific experiment. So, how do we define variables in terms of scientific experiment? Variables are the features, traits, or circumstances that are taken into account during an experiment. From here, we know variables changes the outcome of the action or events. But how do we actually use this information to perform a scientific experiment? Let's understand this with an example. Let's say you are a very good football player. You had a match today, but your team suffered heavy loss. Using our knowledge of science, here the performance of you and your team is the action or event. So, what are the variables then? 1. Maybe you couldn't perform well because you had some injury. 2. Maybe your team coordination was messed up this time. 3. Maybe some valuable players from your team were missing in the game. Here, the reason could be anything. But what if all three things we assume had actually happened? In that case, can you find real solid reason for your bad performance? No, it would be difficult, right? Because one reason will overlap the other, making it complicated to know the real reason why your team suffered loss. And that is what happens with the variables during a scientific experiment. Yes, there can be multiple variables that can affect an event, and the real reason why the event was altered can be difficult to find if variables will overlap. So, how do we minimize this problem? We only take one variable into account, keeping all the other variables unchanged or constant. That way, if the action of the event is altered, we will be sure what caused that change, since there will be only one variable causing that action. Now, since we choose the variable during our scientific experiment, this separates variables into different categories. Types of variables. In scientific experiments, there are three types of variables: independent, dependent, and the controlled variables. Let's take a closer look at their definitions. The independent variable is the variable that can be changed by the researcher throughout the experiment. This variable is manipulated to observe its effects on the dependent variable. For example, in our experiment, the amount of sunlight would be the independent variable, because we will change the amount of light to see its effects on plant growth. The dependent variable, on the other hand, is the variable that is tested in the experiment to determine its value. It is the variable that is expected to change as a result of the manipulation of the independent variable. Therefore, quality of plant growth will be the dependent variable. Lastly, controlled variables are the variables that are kept constant throughout the experiment. In our experiment, the quality of sea, amount of water, and quality of soil would be controlled variables, since it will remain same throughout the experiment. Let's take a quick revision of what we have learned today. Variables are things that can change the result of an experiment. There are three types of variables: independent, dependent, and controlled. Independent variables are continuously changed during an experiment. It can change the dependent variable. Dependent variables, on the other hand, changes as a result of the independent variables. Controlled variables are kept constant. They will remain unchanged throughout the experiment. One more thing. There can be only one dependent and independent variable at one time, but there can be multiple controlled variables at once. I hope the concept is clear now. If you liked the video, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. See you again next time.